Have you ever caught yourself saying, "Life is so short"? It slips out almost without thinking, when a birthday arrives faster than expected, when a loved one passes away, or when you suddenly realize a decade has flown by in the blink of an eye. And in that moment, the weight of time presses on your chest. You wonder, where did it all go? But here is a question worth pausing for. Is life really short, or are we just lost in illusions that make it seem that way? Most people don't actually live their lives, they only pass through them. They wake up, chase after tasks, get distracted by endless noise, and collapse at the end of the day. Tomorrow, the cycle repeats. Days blur into weeks, weeks into years, and suddenly they look back and say, "Time is slipping through my fingers." But the truth is, time didn't run away. We simply weren't there to live it. We were too busy rushing toward a future that never came, or replaying a past that never returned. That's why life feels short. Not because it is short, but because we weren't awake for most of it. Think about it. A child can spend an entire afternoon watching ants crawl on the ground and feel like eternity has unfolded before their eyes. But as adults, we can sit in traffic for an hour and feel like no time at all has passed, only irritation. Why the difference? It's not time itself, it's the state of our mind. Illusion steals life from us. The illusion that we must always be busy. The illusion that happiness is somewhere else, waiting after the next achievement. The illusion that tomorrow will be better than today. These illusions are like thieves, quietly taking away the only thing we truly own, this very moment. And yet, there's another way to live. When you see through the illusion, every moment expands. What once felt short now becomes infinite. A single breath can feel as rich as a lifetime. The sound of rain, the warmth of tea in your hands, the gentle rise and fall of your chest, these ordinary experiences can suddenly reveal extraordinary depth. So, life is not short. What is short is our attention. What is limited is not time, but the way we spend it. The moment you awaken to this truth, life opens wide. And this is where our journey begins, discovering how to dissolve illusion, reclaim the fullness of every moment, and realize that life is not rushing past you. It has been here, waiting for you all along. If life doesn't feel short because of time itself, then what is it that robs us? The answer lies in one word: illusion. Illusion is subtle. It doesn't arrive with a warning sign. It doesn't knock on your door and say, "I'm here to deceive you." No, it slips silently into the mind, shaping the way you see the world without you even noticing. And once it takes root, you mistake it for reality. But let's pause and ask, what exactly is illusion? It is the belief that things are permanent when in truth everything changes. It is the belief that happiness is found out there, in wealth, possessions, relationships, or recognition, when in truth joy is an inner state. It is the belief that we are separate, small, fragile beings trapped in bodies, when in truth we are expressions of something far larger than ourselves. Illusion isn't just false thinking, it's a cage made of thoughts. And the bars of that cage are invisible, which makes them even harder to escape. Consider this: how often do you say to yourself, "When I achieve this, then I'll be happy. When I get through this struggle, then I can rest. When I retire, then I'll finally live." That then never comes, because the mind always creates another illusion, another condition, another reason to postpone your life. And in the meantime, the present moment, the only place life truly exists, slips away unnoticed. Another illusion is the idea of the self. We cling to our name, our face, our story, as if that is who we are. But what happens when someone insults us? We feel attacked. What happens when we lose a job? We feel destroyed. Why? Because we tied our identity to something that was never stable to begin with. We built our sense of me on sand and then wondered why it always shifts beneath us. Illusion feeds suffering. It whispers, "You are not enough." It insists, "You must compare yourself to others." It convinces you that you are incomplete, so you chase endlessly, forgetting that wholeness was within you all along. And the greatest trick of illusion is this: it convinces you that it doesn't exist. You believe you're seeing reality when in fact you're staring at a reflection in a distorted mirror. But once you notice it, once you see how illusion shapes your desires, fears, and choices, something incredible happens. A crack forms in the mirror. Light begins to shine through. You realize you don't have to keep living inside a dream. You can wake up. And waking up doesn't mean escaping life. It means seeing life clearly. It means recognizing that the world is not against you, time is not your enemy, and happiness is not a prize waiting in the future. It's here, now, always. This is why illusion is both the enemy and the teacher, because when you see through it, you reclaim your freedom. So the question becomes, how does illusion steal our sense of time? How does it convince us that life is slipping away too quickly? The answer lies in the way the mind plays tricks with past and future. And that is where our journey leads next. We've seen how illusion clouds our vision, how it convinces us to chase shadows. But one of its most powerful tricks is the way it distorts our sense of time. Think about it. Why do we say life feels short? Because in our experience, the years seem to rush by. Birthdays come faster. Decades vanish. But time itself hasn't changed. A minute is still 60 seconds. An hour is still 60 minutes. What has changed is the mind, and the way it plays with memory and expectation. The mind is rarely where the body is. The body sits here, breathing alive in this very moment. But the mind, it's wandering. It's replaying old regrets, old conversations, old mistakes. Or it's projecting into the future, worrying, planning, imagining what might happen tomorrow or 10 years from now. This wandering is what makes time slippery. You spend hours thinking about the past, but in reality, those hours were lived right now. You spend days anxious about the future, but the future never arrived. It was always the present. And so, entire seasons of life disappear while the mind was anywhere but here. That's why people look back and say, where did the time go? It didn't go anywhere. You simply weren't present to live it. Children remind us of this truth. For a child, an afternoon can feel like a lifetime. Why? Because they are fully absorbed in the moment. They're not worried about next week. They're not reliving yesterday. They're here with the ants, with the sunlight, with the sound of laughter. For them, time stretches wide open. As adults, though, our minds shrink time. We multitask, we rush. We measure every hour against productivity. We sit in meetings, scroll through screens, and before we know it, another year has gone by. The faster we chase, the shorter life feels. Here's the paradox. The more you run after time, the less you have. But the more you rest in the present, the more time reveals itself to you. A single mindful breath can feel like eternity. A walk under the evening sky can feel like a vast ocean of being. The Buddha often compared the mind to a monkey, restless, jumping from branch to branch, never still. And when the monkey mind rules, time feels fractured. But when the mind quiets, even briefly, life feels whole. So, the problem is not time itself. The problem is how we use our attention. The mind tells us we're running out of time, but that's just another illusion. What we're actually running out of is presence. And when presence returns, time no longer feels like an enemy. It becomes a companion. Instead of slipping through your fingers, it sits with you gently like a trusted friend. But there is another layer to this story. Illusion doesn't only distort time. It also clings to the body, to the fear of losing it, to the inevitability of death. And unless we face this directly, the trick of time continues to haunt us. Which brings us to the next step in our journey. Understanding the body, impermanence, and the reality of death, not as a threat, but as a doorway to freedom. The body, this fragile vessel we carry through life. It is both a miracle and a reminder. A miracle because within it beats a heart that has never once paused since the moment of birth. A reminder because every heartbeat also brings us closer to our final breath. Most of us avoid thinking about death. We push it aside, whisper about it in hushed tones, or cover it with jokes. We treat it like an intruder at the door. But the truth is, death is not outside of us. It has always been walking alongside us, as natural as the shadow that follows your body in sunlight. The Buddha himself faced this reality. As a prince, he lived in a palace shielded from suffering, surrounded by luxury and beauty. But one day when he stepped beyond those walls, he encountered three sights that changed his life forever. An old man, frail and bent. a sick man groaning in pain and a corpse, lifeless and still. In that moment, he realized what his father had tried to hide. Aging, sickness, and death are not exceptions, they are the rule of life. And so he left the palace not out of despair but out of courage. He wanted to face these truths directly and discover if there was a path beyond fear. Now ask yourself, how often do you live as if death does not exist? You plan for the next 10 years, the next 20, sometimes even the next 50. You accumulate wealth, possessions, and achievements as though you will carry them forever. But every body has an expiration date. Yours, mine, everyone's. This is not meant to frighten you, it is meant to free you. Because when you deeply accept that the body will one day return to dust, something shifts. You stop clinging so tightly. You stop wasting energy on trivial battles, on endless comparisons, on shallow pursuits. Death strips away the unnecessary and leaves you face to face with what really matters. Think of a flower. Its beauty lies not just in its bloom, but in its impermanence. You cherish it because you know it will wither. If it lasted forever, you would stop noticing. Life is the same. Its fragility gives it depth. Its impermanence makes it precious. There is an old Zen saying, "The man who has died before his death does not fear death." What does that mean? It means if you have already let go of your illusions, if you have already surrendered the false idea that this body defines who you are, then death holds no terror. It is only the body that ends, not the essence of your being. But let's be honest, accepting this is not easy. The body feels so real, so personal. You look in the mirror and see wrinkles forming, hair turning gray, muscles weakening, and the mind panics, whispering, "I am disappearing." But what if that is not true? What if you are not the body, but the awareness that witnesses it? What if death is not the end, but simply a transition, like changing clothes when one set has worn out? The body is your home for now, but it is not your prison. It is a vehicle, a tool, a teacher. And death is the reminder that you must use this tool wisely before it is gone. So, instead of resisting death, learn from it. Let it teach you urgency without panic, clarity without fear, gratitude without attachment. When you wake up each morning, remember, one day this body will not wake again. Suddenly, even a simple breath feels sacred. Even a simple touch feels miraculous. And perhaps this is the greatest gift of all. Death, when faced directly, does not shrink life. It expands it. It makes every moment shine brighter. It invites you to live not half asleep, but fully awake. Yet to live awake, we must understand how to walk the line between extremes. Because death also teaches us another truth. Life is not about having everything, nor about renouncing everything. It is about discovering the middle way. We've seen how the body reminds us of impermanence, how death strips away illusions and leaves us with what truly matters. But there's another layer of illusion that runs even deeper than the body, something so intimate, so subtle that most people never question it. It is the idea of I, the self. From the moment we're born, we begin constructing this identity. We say, "This is my body. These are my thoughts. This is my story." We gather labels like shells on the beach. I am a mother, a father, a student, a worker, successful, a failure, loved, abandoned. Over time, these labels harden into what we call me. But here's the paradox. The more tightly we cling to this me, the more fragile life feels. Why? Because the self is never stable. The body changes, relationships change, thoughts change. And yet the ego, the false sense of a permanent I, keeps grasping, keeps defending, keeps demanding recognition. Buddhism calls this clinging tanha, craving for existence, craving for recognition, craving for permanence. And with craving comes suffering. Imagine holding water in your hand. The harder you squeeze, the faster it slips through your fingers. That is the nature of attachment. Think about how often suffering comes not from reality itself, but from the stories we attach to reality. Someone criticizes you. Instantly, the ego flares. How dare they speak to me that way? Pain arises not because of the words themselves, but because the ego interprets them as a threat to its identity. Or imagine losing a job. The loss is real, yes, but the suffering deepens when the ego whispers, I am worthless. I am a failure. My life is over. And yet, who is this I that suffers? If you sit quietly and look within, you will not find a solid self. You find thoughts, emotions, sensations always changing, never fixed. Just as clouds drift across the sky, the contents of your mind drift across awareness. There is no unchanging cloud self, only the vast sky that holds them. The Buddha compared this illusion of self to a flame. We see continuity in fire, but in reality it is a chain of burning particles, always changing, never the same from one moment to the next. In the same way, the I you cling to is nothing more than a flow of conditions, body, mind, perception, memory, all constantly in flux. So what happens when you stop clinging? When you loosen your grip on identity? Suddenly, freedom opens. You are no longer defined by success or failure, praise or blame, gain or loss. These things still come and go, but they no longer imprison you. You become like a tree rooted deeply in the earth. Storms may shake your branches, but they cannot uproot your being. Of course, letting go of attachment doesn't mean abandoning life. It doesn't mean cold indifference. It means living fully without making your happiness dependent on what cannot last. It means enjoying beauty without fearing its loss. It means loving deeply without clinging desperately. There is a story of a Zen master who held a beautiful porcelain cup. He said to his students, "For me, this cup is already broken. When I drink from it, it is perfect. When it falls and shatters, it is already broken. I am at peace either way." This is the heart of non-attachment, not rejection, but freedom. You still drink from the cup, you still treasure it, but you do not bind your joy to its survival. And here's the secret. The more you let go, the more fully you can love. Because true love is not possession. It is not "you belong to me." It is the freedom to let others be who they are moment by moment. So ask yourself, what stories of I am I clinging to? What possessions, titles, or roles have I mistaken for my identity? What would it feel like to loosen my grip, even just a little? The journey of the self is not about erasing identity, but about seeing through its illusion. When you see clearly, attachment softens and suffering begins to dissolve. And as this grip on I loosens, something remarkable begins to happen. You discover that life flows more easily, that clarity and balance naturally arise. This brings us to another key teaching: how to live not in extremes, but in harmony with the middle way. What if the key to stepping out of illusion has been sitting quietly inside of you this whole time? No grand philosophy, no dramatic breakthrough, just the simple, grounded act of being here. That is the heart of mindfulness. Not a technique to master, not a trend to chase, but a way of reclaiming your own presence. When we live without mindfulness, the mind drifts endlessly, forward into worries, backward into regrets. We run after deadlines, dreams, desires. We wake up, go through routines, and before we know it, days blur into weeks, weeks into years. Life begins to feel like water slipping through the fingers, and that is why many whisper, life is too short. But life isn't short. What's missing is the space to truly live it. Mindfulness is that space. Imagine you are drinking a cup of tea. Normally, the mind races somewhere else while the hand moves automatically. But when you pause and taste the warmth, notice the aroma, feel the cup resting in your palms, you are no longer a machine rushing through life. You are awake. In that simple sip, time stretches. What seemed fleeting becomes infinite. The beauty of mindfulness is its accessibility. You don't need to escape to a monastery or retreat to the mountains. You can breathe here now, wherever you stand. The next inhale is a doorway back to yourself. The next step is a reminder of the ground beneath you. Life returns not by changing the outside world, but by shifting how you relate to each moment. Yet, mindfulness is not about slowing everything down in some artificial way. It is about depth, not speed. You can walk briskly through a crowded street, but if you're aware of the rhythm of your feet, the rise and fall of your breath, the faces that pass you, then you are present. Suddenly, the noise transforms into aliveness. Mindfulness reveals that nothing is mundane. Every sound, every sight, every breath is sacred when seen clearly. And here's the secret many overlook. Mindfulness is not passive. It does not mean sitting still and watching life drift by. It is a practice of radical engagement. You are saying yes to reality exactly as it is. You're not fighting against the weather of your mind, nor are you lost in its storms. You're standing right in the middle of the rain, but you're no longer wet. Through mindfulness, even suffering transforms. Pain, when resisted, becomes unbearable. But when you meet it with mindful attention, it softens. Think of a headache. Normally, the mind spins with frustration. Why now? I can't deal with this. That resistance amplifies the suffering. But if you turn toward it, feeling the tightness, acknowledging the throb, breathing into the ache, you discover space. The pain is there, but it no longer owns you. This is why mindfulness is more than stress relief. It is liberation. Each mindful breath untangles you from illusion. Each mindful step brings you closer to truth. And the more you practice, the more you realize time is not racing, life is not slipping away. You are here, and here is vast. But mindfulness alone is not the end of the journey. It is a foundation, a homecoming. Once you learn to return to the present, you begin to see deeper layers, how the body, the mind, and even the sense of self are constantly changing. And in that seeing, something extraordinary opens, freedom from fear. Because when you are no longer trapped in the illusion of permanence, the fear of loss begins to dissolve. And this brings us to a question many avoid, yet every soul must face. If mindfulness reveals the truth of the present, how does it change our relationship with death? Is death an end, or just another illusion waiting to be pierced? What if the happiness you've been chasing all your life was never meant to be chased at all? What if joy wasn't something you earned after reaching goals, buying possessions, or winning approval, but something that was already flowing quietly inside you, waiting to be noticed? This is the radical truth of unconditional happiness. Most of us grow up believing happiness is a reward. Achieve success, find love, secure wealth, and then joy will follow. And sometimes it does, briefly. But the moment conditions shift, the happiness slips away. That promotion eventually loses its thrill, that relationship encounters storms, that possession grows old. Then we find ourselves asking, why does nothing last? Why can't I stay happy? The problem is not that life fails us. The problem is that we tied happiness to conditions that were never stable to begin with. Unconditional happiness begins when we loosen that knot. Imagine the sky on a stormy day. Clouds come and go, dark, heavy, sometimes fierce. But behind them, the vast sky never disappears. In the same way, conditions in your life rise and fall, but beneath them is an inner stillness untouched by success or failure, praise or blame, gain or loss. That stillness is where unconditional joy lies. Think of a child laughing, not because they earned it, but because they are alive, breathing, playing. They don't need a reason. Their joy is raw, unfiltered, and free. Somewhere along the way, we lost that innocence and replaced it with conditions. I'll be happy when. But mindfulness teaches us that joy is not on the other side of achievement. It's right here in the breath, in the awareness that this moment exists, that you exist. And here's something powerful. Unconditional happiness doesn't mean denying pain. It doesn't mean plastering a smile over heartbreak or pretending everything is fine. It means discovering that even within pain, there's a space untouched by it. When you sit with suffering without resistance, you find a strange, quiet joy, not in the pain itself, but in your capacity to be present with it. It is the joy of knowing you are more than what you feel. This shift is revolutionary. It means your happiness is no longer held hostage by the outside world. You don't need to wait for life to be perfect to feel alive. You don't need to escape sadness before you can smile. You can meet every circumstance with a kind of inner steadiness because you've discovered the source of joy isn't out there, it's within. Many spiritual teachers call this contentment. Not complacency, not passivity, but a deep acceptance of the present moment. Contentment doesn't kill ambition or silence creativity, it liberates them. When you are no longer desperate to grasp at happiness, you create freely, love openly, and live fully. Your actions flow from fullness, not from lack. And when you realize this, life stops being a constant race. There's nothing to chase, nothing to prove. You can work hard, build dreams, pursue passions, but your happiness no longer dangles at the finish line. It walks with you step by step. That is unconditional freedom. But this raises a question. If happiness isn't dependent on conditions, then how do we practice living this truth every day? How do we train ourselves to return again and again to this unshakable joy? We spend so much of life holding on to memories that haunt us, to identities that limit us, to possessions and people we fear to lose. The tighter we grip, the heavier life feels. Yet wisdom whispers something counterintuitive. True strength comes not from holding, but from letting go. Letting go does not mean giving up, nor does it mean indifference. It is not coldness, nor neglect. Letting go is the clarity to see what is real and what is illusion, and the courage to release what chains the heart. Imagine carrying a backpack filled with rocks everywhere you go. At first, you may not notice the weight, but over time, every step grows exhausting. One day, someone tells you, you don't have to carry this. That moment of release is what wisdom brings. But why do we resist letting go? Because the ego thrives on ownership. This is my success, my pain, my story. It clings to labels and attachments, believing they define us. Without them, who would we be? Yet wisdom shows us we are not the possessions we cling to, nor the emotions that rise and fall. We are the vast awareness that holds them all. To let go is not to lose, it is to return to our true nature. Consider anger. We hold on to it, replaying the moment we were wronged, feeding the fire with stories. But anger is a burning coal we grip with bare hands. It hurts us more than anyone else. Letting go doesn't mean the wrong never happened. It means we stop wounding ourselves with it. That release is an act of wisdom, a gift to our own heart. The same is true for desire. Desire whispers, I will be happy when, and so we chase endlessly, believing fulfillment lies in the next achievement, the next purchase, the next relationship. But once obtained, desire shifts its shape, pointing us to the next thing. It never ends. Wisdom sees through this illusion and dares to let go, not by suppressing desire, but by no longer letting it rule the mind. Suddenly, the grip loosens and peace flows in. And what about grief? Perhaps the hardest letting go of all. The people we love will not stay forever. Time will take them just as it will one day take us. The heart resists this truth and grief feels unbearable. Yet wisdom does not erase grief. It transforms it. It reminds us that love does not end with absence. That letting go of clinging does not mean letting go of love. It means honoring the impermanence of life and allowing love to flow without possession. Letting go, then, is not a single act but a lifelong practice. It begins in small ways, releasing a harsh word before it leaves your lips, unclenching your jaw when tension rises, loosening the story you tell yourself about who you must be. Each act of letting go lightens the load. Each release deepens your freedom. Wisdom and letting go are two sides of the same coin. Wisdom reveals that everything is impermanent, that clinging creates suffering. Letting go is the embodiment of that wisdom in daily life. And together, they unlock a profound truth. When your hands are empty, your heart is full. But this truth invites us deeper. If letting go lightens the soul, then what does it mean to live fully unburdened, with nothing to prove and nothing to fear? How would life unfold when every moment is embraced without grasping? There comes a point on the journey when you realize freedom was never about the outside world, not about wealth or power, not about having every door open for you, not even about being free from responsibility. True freedom is something much quieter, much deeper. It is the unshakable peace that lives inside you, untouched by circumstances. Inner freedom begins when you are no longer a prisoner of your own mind. Most people live under the rule of their thoughts and emotions. Anger rises and they lash out. Fear whispers and they hide. Desire pulls and they chase. The mind commands and they obey. But freedom comes when you recognize, I am not my thoughts. I am not my emotions. I am the awareness that sees them. In that moment, the chains begin to fall away. Think of a bird in a cage. The cage may look golden, comfortable, even safe, but it is still a cage. For many of us, that cage is built from expectations, comparisons, judgments, and fears. We decorate it with success, relationships, and possessions, but deep down, we feel confined. Inner freedom is not about breaking the cage violently. It is about realizing the door was open all along. You simply have to step out. This freedom does not mean life becomes easy or that suffering disappears. Storms still come. People will still misunderstand you. Life will still throw uncertainty your way, and the body will still age and decline. But with inner freedom, you are no longer tossed around by these storms. You carry a stillness that no wind can shake. You may walk through fire, but the fire does not consume you. What does it feel like to live with inner freedom? It feels like walking lightly, like breathing without effort, like meeting life without resistance. Someone criticizes you, but you are not destroyed because your worth no longer depends on their words. A desire arises, but you are not enslaved because you know happiness does not depend on its fulfillment. Pain comes, but you do not drown because you know it will pass. This way of living is not distant or mystical. It is available to you right now. It begins with awareness. Each time you pause before reacting, you taste freedom. Each time you breathe into discomfort instead of running from it, you taste freedom. Each time you let go of clinging and rest in the present, you taste freedom. Over time, these small tastes expand into a way of being. Inner freedom also transforms how you relate to others. When you are no longer ruled by ego or fear, you love more openly. You no longer try to possess, control, or manipulate. Love becomes spacious, generous, unconditional. Compassion flows naturally because you are no longer protecting a fragile self. You are living from wholeness. And here lies the ultimate gift of inner freedom. Life stops feeling short. When every moment is met fully without clinging or fear, time expands. Days no longer blur together. They shine with clarity. Even ordinary moments, washing dishes, walking to the store, sitting in silence, become radiant with aliveness. Freedom is not far away. It is right here, woven into the simple act of being awake. And so, as the journey unfolds, one question remains. If inner freedom is the essence of true living, then what is the final message we must carry into our lives? The truth that ties everything together. So here we arrive, not at an ending, but at a beginning. We have traveled through the illusions of time, of self, of clinging, of fear. We have touched mindfulness, unconditional happiness, wisdom, letting go, and inner freedom. And through it all, one truth shines clearly: life is not short. It only feels short when we live inside the illusion. Think about it. When you are lost in thought, days vanish. When you cling to desires, years blur. When you fight reality, life feels heavy, fleeting, out of reach. But the moment you awaken, even for a single breath, the illusion breaks. That breath feels eternal. That moment feels whole. And if you can live that way, moment by moment, then life is not a race to the end. It is a vast unfolding, rich and abundant, right here and now. Life is short has always been a story we tell ourselves, a way to measure existence through clocks and calendars. But clocks cannot measure aliveness. Calendars cannot contain presence. The truth is, your life is not made of years. It is made of moments. And when you inhabit those moments fully, you discover that time is not rushing past you. You are living timelessly, in harmony with what is. Living truly doesn't mean renouncing the world. It doesn't mean escaping responsibility or ignoring dreams. It means meeting each moment as it comes, without clinging or resistance, without needing it to be different than it is. It means tasting your food instead of rushing, listening deeply instead of waiting to reply, breathing in gratitude simply because you are alive. And yes, death will come. The body will return to dust, just as it always has for every living being. But when you live authentically without illusion, death is not a thief. It is simply a natural closing of the book. The story remains complete not because of its length, but because it was lived fully, page by page, word by word, moment by moment. So if there is one message to carry with you, let it be this: life is not short. What is short is our willingness to live awake. What is short is our courage to let go, to love fully, to be present. The illusion is short-lived, but the truth that you are here now is eternal. Live without illusion, live without fear, live without delay. Not tomorrow, not someday, but now. Because the secret is simple. The moment you live truly, the illusion disappears, and life reveals its vastness. And so, the invitation is clear. Don't just survive your days, inhabit them. Don't just measure your life, live it. Life is not short, only the illusion is. And once you see that, you are free. If this message touched your heart, if it helped you pause and breathe a little deeper, consider joining us on this path of wisdom. Subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom, where we continue to share timeless Buddhist teaching, stories, and reflections that guide us toward peace, clarity, and freedom. Your presence here matters. Every moment you choose to listen, reflect, and awaken, you are planting seeds of wisdom not just for yourself, but for the world around you. So stay with us, walk this path with us, and let's discover together how life, once freed from illusion, is never truly short. It is vast, luminous, and complete. Thank you for watching. May you live each moment fully, and may peace be with you.